104 air-to-air kills, 0 losses, 50 years of combat service across 6 air forces on 4 continents. No other fighter aircraft in the history of aerial warfare owns a record like that. The Spitfire doesn't. The F-86 Sabre and MiG-21 don't either. Nothing comes close. The cockpit of an F-15 smells like hydraulic fluid and sweat-soaked Nomex. 45,000 pounds of McDonnell Douglas engineering, wrapped around 2 Pratt & Whitney F-100 turbofans, each producing 23,900 pounds of thrust in afterburner. A thrust-to-weight ratio greater than 1:1, meaning the Eagle can accelerate going straight up. The airframe looks wrong, almost too large for a fighter, with that massive wing planform spanning 42 feet 10 inches. Engineers at St. Louis designed it with zero compromise for the ground attack mission. Every square inch of that airplane exists to find, chase, and kill other airplanes. Colonel Wendell Sawyer, one of the early test pilots at Edwards, put it plainly in a 1972 flight evaluation. This aircraft does not want to stop flying. No sentence buried in a test report ever described the program more accurately. The F-15 exists because American pilots died in Vietnam at rates that horrified the Pentagon. The Navy's kill ratio over North Vietnam in 1965 through 68 hovered around 2:1. The Air Force fared worse in some periods. American fighters, the F-4 Phantom, a brilliant interceptor pressed into dogfighting service it never trained for, fought MiG-17s and MiG-21s with missiles that failed 40% of the time and no internal gun. Sparrow reliability rates in the Rolling Thunder campaign ran so low that some crews called the weapon a $50,000 bottle rocket. The Air Force lost 881 fixed-wing aircraft over Southeast Asia between 1962 and 1973. Not all to fighters, most to SAMs and AAA. But the ones lost in air combat stung differently because the United States had built its entire tactical air doctrine around the assumption of total air superiority, and the skies over Hanoi proved that assumption hollow. If any of this means something to the people who lived it, the crew chiefs, the weapons officers, the pilots who strapped into Eagle cockpits at Kadena or Bitburg or Dahran, drop your squadron and your years in the comments. Subscribe if the channel earns it. Hit like so the algorithm pushes this toward the people who already know how the story ends. The F-15 didn't come from confidence. It came from failure. September 1966. A North Vietnamese People's Air Force MiG-21, piloted by an officer whose name the records don't preserve, fired an Atoll heatseeker at an F-105 Thunder Chief over Route Pack 6. The missile tracked true. The thud, 60,000 pounds of Republic aviation iron hauling 6,000 pounds of bombs through the thickest air defense network on Earth, never saw it coming. The pilot ejected into captivity. His wingman, pulling 7 Gs in a desperate brake turn, watched the fireball tumble through haze that smelled like cordite and jet fuel, even at 15,000 feet. He had no radar missile. His sidewinder growled intermittently. The MiG-21 disappeared into cloud cover doing Mach 1.4. Nothing in the American inventory could have caught it. John Boyd sat at a steel desk in the Pentagon and understood exactly why. Boyd held the rank of colonel. He held no command. What he held, and wielded like a weapon against every general officer who crossed his path, was a mathematical framework called energy maneuverability theory. EM theory reduced every fighter aircraft ever built to a set of curves plotting specific excess power against Mach number and altitude. The charts told a pilot, in cold arithmetic, where his airplane could outperform an adversary and where it could not. Boyd and his civilian mathematician partner, Thomas Christie, ran the numbers on every Soviet fighter they could model. The F-4 Phantom lost energy in a sustained turn against a MiG-21 at most combat altitudes. The data explained the kill ratios. The data also enraged the tactical air command generals who had spent a decade insisting missiles made dogfighting obsolete. The word mafia landed on Boyd's group almost by accident. A Pentagon staffer, sources conflict on whether it came from a sympathetic analyst or a hostile one, called Boyd and his circle the Fighter Mafia sometime around 1969. Boyd liked it. The name stuck to a loose coalition that included Pierre Sprey, a civilian analyst with no engineering degree, who nonetheless grasped aircraft design trade-offs better than most program managers, and Everest Riccioni, an Air Force colonel who drafted the first unofficial requirement document for what he labeled the F-XX. Three men with no budget, no authority, no institutional backing, and no reason to believe the Air Force would listen. Boyd's central demand read like heresy to an Air Force addicted to multi-role complexity. Build a fighter that does nothing but fight other fighters. Not a pound for air to ground. No bombing computer. No heavy radar optimized for ground mapping. Maximum thrust to weight. Maximum wing area for sustained turning. A cockpit with visibility so complete that a pilot could check his own 6 o'clock without contorting his spine. Every ounce of weight justified against one question. Does this help kill a MiG? If your airplane can't turn, can't climb, and can't accelerate, it doesn't matter what you hang on it. Boyd said that to anyone who'd listen, and several who wouldn't. The formal requirement emerged in 1969 as the FX program. The Air Force wanted a Mach 2.5 interceptor weighing 60,000 pounds. Boyd wanted a 40,000-pound knife fighter. Both couldn't win. The smell of burning kerosene hung over the Negev on June 27, 1979, when Israeli Air Force F-15s drew first blood. 4 Eagles from the 133rd Squadron intercepted a formation of Syrian MiG-21s over southern Lebanon. Captain Moshe Melnick fired an AIM-7 Sparrow at a MiG pulling hard into a defensive break. The missile guided true. The MiG came apart at 12,000 feet. Within 90 seconds, 3 more Syrian fighters fell. 4 shots, 4 kills, 0 losses. The Israeli pilots landed at Tel Nof with the stink of burnt rubber from hard braking still rising off the tires and a kill ratio that read like a typo. 3 years later, the Bekaa Valley, June 9, 1982. The Israeli Air Force launched Operation Mole Cricket, 19 against Syrian SAM batteries and their MiG fighter screen in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. The Syrians operated 19 SA-6 batteries, the same system that had savaged Israeli aircraft over the Sinai in 1973. They flew MiG-21s and MiG-23s, piloted by officers trained at Soviet academies, directed by Soviet-supplied ground control intercept radar. The air defense network looked formidable on paper. It lasted about 2 hours. Israeli F-15s and F-16s destroyed all 19 SAM sites and then turned on the Syrian fighters, scrambling from bases around Damascus. The final tally over 2 days of fighting: 82 Syrian aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, 0 Israeli losses. The F-15 accounted for the majority of those kills, using a mix of Sparrows and Sidewinders, at ranges the Syrian pilots never closed inside of. Syrian GCI controllers kept vectoring fresh MiGs into the fight. Israeli radar picked them up 40 miles out. The Eagles met them head-on with beyond visual range shots, then closed for the merge on anything that survived the initial volley. A declassified Israeli after-action assessment uses the phrase systematic annihilation. Their phrase. The Syrians had numbers. They had ground control. They had a dense overlapping SAM umbrella that should have forced Israeli fighters into predictable corridors. Every advantage they held produced the opposite of its intended result. GCI vectoring fed MiGs into kill boxes. The SAM network, destroyed in the opening minutes, left fighters naked. Numerical superiority meant more targets. The designation Baz, Hebrew for Falcon, came from the Israeli Air Force's tradition of naming fighters after birds of prey. The F-16 got Nets, the Sparrowhawk. The F-4 Phantom carried Kurnas, the sledgehammer, which tells a different story about how the Israelis viewed that airframe's elegance. January 17, 1991. Coalition air forces crossed the Iraqi border at 3 a.m. local time. Captain Steve Tate of the 1st Tactical Fighter Wing, flying an F-15 Charlie out of Dhahran, locked an Iraqi Mirage F-1 at 30 miles with his APG-63 radar. The Sparrow tracked through darkness and rain. The Mirage broke apart at 22,000 feet over the western Iraqi desert. First air-to-air kill of Desert Storm. Over the next 43 days, F-15 Charlies from the 33rd, 36th, and 53rd Tactical Fighter Squadrons compiled 36 confirmed air-to-air victories. MiG-29s, MiG-25s, MiG-23s, Mirage F-1s, Su-22s, even 2 Iraqi helicopters. 0 F-15s lost to enemy aircraft. Captain Cesar Rodriguez scored 2 MiG-29 kills, one with a Sparrow, one with a Sidewinder, on consecutive sorties, the smell of his own sweat still sharp in his oxygen mask from the first engagement when he strapped in for the second. Iraqi pilots flew Soviet equipment competently. Some showed real aggression, pressing intercepts against numerical odds. Captain Rory Drager's gun camera footage from January 29th shows a MiG-29 closing to merge with him head-on before Drager's aim. 7 caught it at 4 miles. That Iraqi pilot committed to the fight. The airplane under him simply could not match what sat under Drager. The APG-63 pulse Doppler radar detected targets at ranges exceeding 100 miles in look-down mode. No Soviet-built fighter radar in Iraqi service came within half that range. Iraqi pilots entered the fight blind against opponents who had tracked them since takeoff. 36-0. The engineers at St. Louis built an airplane to kill MiGs. It killed MiGs. The F-15 is simply too costly to justify in the quantities required. That line appears in a 1977 Government Accountability Office report, recommending the Air Force cap Eagle procurement and shift funding toward the cheaper F-16. Unit cost in 1974 dollars, $15 million per airframe. Adjusted for inflation, roughly $65 million in today's money. The Pentagon's answer to a fighter that had never lost an air-to-air engagement was to buy fewer of them. The F-16, Boyd's lightweight fighter, the airplane the fighter mafia actually wanted, became the high-volume solution. Smaller, cheaper, single-engine, multi-role from birth. 793 F-15s built for the Air Force against over 2,300 F-16s. The logic ran like this. The Eagle costs too much, does too little beyond air superiority, and air superiority itself matters less now that Soviet aviation looks manageable. Then, the F-22 Raptor program started in 1986, explicitly designed to replace the Eagle with stealth, supercruise, and a price tag that made the F-15 look like a bargain. Lockheed won the ATF competition in 1991. The Raptor would render the Eagle obsolete by 2005. The timeline survived contact with procurement reality for about 6 years. The Air Force originally planned to buy 750 F-22s. Congress cut that to 187. Unit cost ballooned past $150 million. The fighter built to replace the Eagle became too expensive to replace the Eagle. The F-15E Strike Eagle, the 2-seat air-to-ground variant that Boyd's Ghost would have despised, flew its first combat sortie on January 17, 1991, hauling bombs into Iraq. Not a pound for air-to-ground, Boyd had demanded. The Strike Eagle carried 23,000 pounds of ordnance. It also retained every air-to-air capability of the Charlie model. McDonnell Douglas solved the weight problem Boyd feared by installing F-100-229 engines, producing 29,000 pounds of thrust each. Brute force over elegant compromise. The airplane grew heavier and uglier, and somehow more capable with every block upgrade. Its conformal fuel tanks bulging along the fuselage like a wrestler who'd put on 40 pounds and gotten stronger. The F-15EX Eagle II entered Air Force service in 2021, a brand new production Eagle, 50 years after first flight. Boeing builds them in St. Louis on tooling descended from the original jigs. Cost per unit, roughly $80 million, half the Raptor's price. The EX carries 12 air-to-air missiles simultaneously. 12. The original F-15 Alpha carried 4 Sparrows and 4 Sidewinders. The airframe's internal structure, overbuilt in the 70s because McDonnell Douglas engineers refused to design to minimum spec, turned out to hold margins nobody anticipated. The excess structural weight the critics mocked in 1974 bought 5 decades of growth, 104 kills. The record stays open. Saudi F-15s scored the most recent confirmed kills, 2 Iraqi Mirage F-1s during Desert Storm. Israeli Eagles have added unconfirmed engagements over Lebanon and Syria in the years since, but official kill counts from the Israeli Air Force remain classified past 1985. The file stays sealed. Boyd retired as a colonel in 1975, never made general, never expected to. He spent his final decades refining a theory of competitive decision-making, called the OODA loop, that influenced Marine Corps doctrine, business strategy, and several hundred LinkedIn posts per day. He died in 1997, at 70, in a small apartment in West Palm Beach, Florida. His personal effects fit in a few boxes. Pierre Spray left Defense Analysis and became a jazz record producer, founded Mapleshade Records, specialized in audiophile pressings. He died in 2020. Everest Riccioni retired from the Air Force, spent years writing papers arguing the F-15 had grown too heavy and too expensive, which put him in the odd position of criticizing the airplane his own requirement document created. He died in 2021 at 97. Captain Moshe Melnick, who scored the Eagles' first air-to-air kill over Lebanon in 1979, retired from the Israeli Air Force and moved into commercial aviation. Captain Steve Tate, first Desert Storm air-to-air kill, left the Air Force in the mid-90s. Cesar Rodriguez retired as a colonel with 3 air-to-air victories, the most of any American fighter pilot since Vietnam. He flies civilian aircraft now. The Air Force's official aircraft scoring record for the F-15 lists 104 victories, 0 defeats, and carries a footnote in small type. No F-15 has ever been lost to enemy aircraft in combat. The footnote has not required updating.